Hi and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Claire Lynch of the Doris and Bertie Writing School, and I'm on a mission to help you become a better, more confident, more persuasive writer. In this video, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about the challenges of writing in English when it's not your first language. So if English is your second language, or if you work with people whose first language isn't English, or frankly, if English is your first language and you're simply interested in learning a bit more about the language you speak, you'll find this video interesting. And what's prompted me to make the video is that I've had quite a few questions from those of you who write in English as your second language, and what I'm sensing is that there seems to be a real anxiety about whether you'll ever be able to be a really confident, persuasive writer in a second language. And here's a typical question that I got from one of you. Can a non-native speaker work with English without feeling like an imposter? So basically, I have a 3-word answer to that question. Yes, yes, and thrice yes. You can absolutely work with English as your second language. And I want you to stop, I mean it, stop feeling like an imposter right now. Promise? Good. So here are 6 reasons why you're not an imposter. Starting with number 1, which is you're not the imposter, I am. Now let me throw a couple of statistics your way. So depending on where you look, figures estimate that roughly nearly 370 million people speak English as their first language. But the total number of English speakers in the world is way, way, way bigger than that. A whopping 1.35 billion people, in fact. So that means roughly 370 million speakers of English as a first language, and what? About 980 million speakers of English as a second language. So if you speak English as a second language, then you are massively, massively in the majority by over 2.5, nearly 3 times as many. So if there are nearly 3 times as many people on planet Earth who speak English as their second language, as there are people like me who speak it as a first language, well, then whose language is it anyway? It's not my language, it's yours. And so who's really the imposter here? Could it be me, not you? Anyway, that brings me to point 2, which is native speaker. What does that even mean? So the other thing to remember is that there's no such thing as the perfect English. There's no pristine English that you as a non-native speaker are desperately, hopelessly grappling to reach, and that we native speakers on the other side of that barrier have smugly achieved. In fact, if perfect English feels out of reach, that's because it doesn't exist, even for so-called native speakers like me. Let me explain what I mean with a handful of examples. A couple from spoken English and then one from written English. So, spoken English first. Now, the greatest TV show ever made was The Wire. I will not accept otherwise. And The Wire is set in Baltimore in the United States, an English-speaking country, right? Yet many people here in the UK, and possibly even in the US too, had to watch it with the subtitles on because they struggled to understand the English spoken in The Wire. And there's another very similar example closer to home, my home at least. Way back in the 80s, there was a famous TV show on British TV called Auf Wiedersehen Pet, and the story was based on a bunch of bricklayers working in Germany. Again, half the people in the UK, the vast majority of them native speakers, like me, had to watch the show with the English subtitles on. Now, was that because the characters were speaking German? No, most of the characters were expats from Newcastle in the north of England, a mere 283 miles north of where I'm standing right now here in London. But the character's accent, called a Geordie accent, was so strong that people outside of Newcastle barely understood a word they were saying. Finally, an example from the written language. A few years ago, I did a writing job for a trendy media firm in Australia, and the average age of the employees was about 20 years younger than me. Now, even though we spoke the same language, English, the client was initially sceptical that a little grey-haired woman on the other side of the planet could really capture their tone of voice. Could I really write in English the way they used English? Now, in the end, I ended up surprising them, delighting them, in fact, with how I was able to capture the vernacular of a bunch of trendy Aussie media types in their 20s. But I was only able to do it by reading a lot of things they themselves had written, and also by consulting the Urban Dictionary, which is an online dictionary of slang and non-standard words. In other words, I had to learn their language, their version of English. Now, the point about all these examples is that these people, the characters in The Wire, the Geordies in Auf Wiedersehen Pet, and the young trendy media types in Melbourne, Australia, all speak English. Different forms of English, yes, but English all the same. And within their communities, they are perfectly well understood. And who is to say that their form of English is any less valid, any less standard than so-called standard English? And what even is standard English when you think of it like that? Which brings me to point number 3. You don't have an accent. I do. So as we've touched on spoken English, I want to talk about the variety of spoken English that I use, especially because some of you have asked about my accent. So I think I speak a fairly standard English. I was born in the northwest of England, so I do have some northern vowels. For example, I will always say bath or path or photograph, not bath or path or photograph. That's how my husband, who was born and bred in London, would say those words, but on me, just sounds wrong and awkward and frankly a bit pretentious. But anyway, when I was growing up, I didn't realise I had an accent. I just spoke like everyone else around me. And it wasn't until I left home and went to university, a university in the north, strangely enough, but that I realised I had a northern accent, because that's when I started hanging out with people from the south. And I kind of had my full northern accent sort of teased out of me by southerners. So, for example, I used to say things like singing and dancing, which sounded normal to me, but I didn't realise I was, to their ears, overemphasising the final G in an almost comical way. That G in singing and dancing is sounded in the northwest where I was born, but it's sort of swallowed in standard southern English, singing and dancing. And today, I probably do swallow that G a bit more. Another thing that happened at university was studying linguistics as part of my first degree, and for that I had to learn to transcribe spoken language phonetically. But the only correct answer on the exam was a transcription based on RP, or received pronunciation, which you may have heard of, and which at that time, maybe not now, I don't know, I suspect things may have changed, but certainly then, RP was considered standard English or the Queen's English, which, when you think about it, makes zero sense. The idea that the really weird type of English spoken by one very posh old lady living a bizarre life in a palace is standard, when millions of people were talking like me with their singings and dancings and all sorts of other accents all over the country. Anyway, that task of writing English phonetically was much harder for me than for my fellow students in the South because, as I discovered, my initial transcriptions were wrong because singing and dancing with an emphasised G was not RP and so was wrong. Anyway, now I live in London and today I think I talk an accent that many people would consider neutral. I don't speak like the Queen. I think I speak maybe a sort of not quite southernish, not quite northernish type of English. So I think to my ears, very, very neutral. And you'd think because of that, my accent's fairly easy to understand. Yeah, you'd think that. But let me throw at you some reviews people have left of my online courses. This course is excellent, though I have some difficulty with the British accent. Accent was not clear with some words. I thought she was an American teacher. Her accent's hard to follow for me. My only problem is to understand the British accent. And my favourite? I was pleasantly surprised by her accent. Who knew English with an English accent was so difficult to understand, let alone could be surprisingly pleasant? I think the point I'm trying to make here is that whatever accent you speak with, someone will always find it more or less correct, more or less difficult to understand. We Brits might think Americans have an accent. After all, the language they speak is English with an American accent, not American with an English accent. But for many people around the world brought up on Hollywood movies, I'm the weird one, and I can totally understand that. I think the point I'm trying to make here is about the idea that there's one original English that non-native speakers are constantly striving and failing to achieve. Because if you're failing to achieve that standard, I am too. Because it's a constantly moving target. And in fact, if you speak English with an Indian accent or a Chinese accent or an Italian or French accent, that might actually be in your favour, especially if you're talking to people from your own culture. Fairly sure I'd more readily understand an English person speaking Italian with an English accent than I would a native Italian speaker. It's kind of something about the vowels just being closer to what my ears are attuned to, and that connection between words on a page and what I naturally hear. So if you're a non-native speaker speaking English to other non-native speakers, you may even have a bit of an advantage over us native speakers. You might actually be easier to understand. Ever thought about it that way? What's more, point 4, English is English because of non-native speakers. Look, even the English we speak in England today is a kind of mongrel, multinational language. It's been influenced by Latin, Greek, French, and a host of other languages. If it weren't, we'd still be speaking the English of the Anglo-Saxons, which, can I remind you, sounds a bit like this. What ich swefne kist sedjan willa, what meia meta to midra nichta, syden reodberend resta wuneden. So in other words, non-native speakers, whether through immigration or colonialism, are exactly the thing that's made English the incredibly rich language it is today. Albeit a language where spelling is an absolute nightmare. Yeah, sorry about that. But you know what? English is still changing, thanks to that international influence. And I think I can see that happening before my very eyes. Now, I'm not a professional linguist, but let me give you some examples from my own experience of working with large international firms, of how I think the international nature of business English is changing the language. As I say, I'm not a professional linguist, so these are just personal observations. But when I hear English native speakers, whatever that means, use a piece of business jargon like learnings, it makes my ears bleed, because strictly speaking, learning is an uncountable noun. You can't pluralise it. You can't just put an S on the end of it and pretend it's a word. My immediate instinct is to think my fellow native speakers are just illiterate and ignorant and pretentious. And then I remember how so many of my international students struggle with uncountable nouns. I can't tell you the number of times a Chinese or Indian or Korean student has asked me for my feedbacks or advices on an essay, or have asked questions about how to avoid jargons, all of which are strictly speaking uncountable nouns. And so when I bristle at learnings, I realise I have to check my privilege, and I start to wonder that maybe the ubiquity of learnings in business English is just an example of native speakers adopting a countable form of an uncountable noun. And maybe that's because they've heard it from a non-native speaker. And maybe, just maybe, learnings is becoming the correct standard form. Ditto prepositions, those little words like in, on, and to that indicate relationships of time and space. For years I have winced every time a business executive talks about reporting into someone instead of reporting to them. It literally sounds obscene to me. Likewise, for years, I've rolled my eyes at English native speakers who, instead of saying they're talking about a topic, say they're talking around it, which to me sounds like the complete opposite of what they mean. To me, to talk around a topic sounds like you're actually discreetly trying to avoid addressing the topic. I've written whole sneery blog posts on this stuff. But do you know what? I think about my own struggles to learn Italian, and especially when it comes to picking the right preposition, oh my word, they're a nightmare. But I think of those struggles and I think maybe those native speakers who mangle what I would deem the correct preposition in English have picked up the habit from an international colleague and absorbed it into their language. And you know what? How wonderful is that? How better to basically say, this is not my language, it's ours. And you, the non-native speaker, have as much power and right to decide what's correct as I have. So we've mostly been talking about grammatical rules and proper accents. Now I want to talk about fuzzier issues, the cultural factors that determine what we expect from communication. So point 5, communication is about so much more than the language you speak. So, as an English teacher at the University of Cambridge, I help international students with their writing and speaking. Now, to get into the University of Cambridge, you obviously have to be pretty smart. You also need to have excellent English skills. So the students I teach, yes, they struggle with their articles, the A and N. Yes, they don't always pick the right preposition. Yes, they may struggle with modals or tenses or vocab. But for the most part, their language skills are incredibly sophisticated. So what they often need most help with isn't the grammar. The grammar is the easy bit. What they most struggle with is expressing their ideas in a way that meets the expectations of an English academic audience. And that's usually more about style and structure and above all clarity than about facility with the language. A colleague of mine often repeats a famous quote that academic English is no one's mother tongue. Even native English speakers have to learn it. So before teaching international students, I just assumed that the way I wrote academically was more or less universal. For example, that insistence we have in English on clarity, concision, and a really tight chain of logic, where ideas are presented in a very step-by-step way. But what I discovered is that that is just one convention, and for example, other cultures may have a different way of expressing logic, which to someone steeped in the Anglo tradition comes across as elusive and wordy and roundabout. So I guess the point here is that whatever language you're writing in, you need to write in a way that's consistent with the conventions of the culture you're writing in. Whether that's the conventions of your field, business writing is different from scientific writing, which is different from writing in the humanities, for example, or the conventions of the country that your audience is based in. So, for example, what if you're writing in English for a Chinese audience, whether that's business or academic? Do you use a very clear, linear English way of communicating, which may come across as patronising? Or do you use a more Chinese approach, something to my eyes might seem less linear and more roundabout? I don't know the answer to that, but the point is that even if we're talking about the softer cultural stuff, there isn't necessarily one right way of doing things. And who knows, different, more international styles and structures and approaches may become conventional within wider business or academic English. While we're on the subject of my international students, I want to leave you with one final thought. Correct grammar isn't the be-all and end-all. A question my students often ask is, can I get a first or a distinction or whatever without perfect English? And my answer is absolutely yes. And I know this because I've had students whose English grammar wasn't perfect. They mixed up their modals and articles and prepositions, and they still went on to get top grades. But the thing they did do was adopt an appropriately academic style and structure in their essays. So good grammar is important, yes, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Phew, that was a long one. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Did you enjoy it? What did you learn? What questions do you still have about communicating in English? Tell me what you think in the comments. In the meantime, happy writing, and just remember, English is as much your language as it is mine. And at the same time, you don't own it, but neither do I. So in that sense, we're all kind of imposters, and we're all not imposters. I hope that makes sense. See you next week. Bye.